evening, 3B. It is time for tonight's story, A Dog's Porpoise. When we left the story last night, the town of Ogunquit was having a meeting with the mayor and the citizens to decide whether or not it was a good idea or a bad idea for Lars and Banger to be playing in the harbor. Some of the folks were for it and some of them were for against it. Hear, hear! Now Nancy Jane was standing and Natalie exhaled, loosening her grip on Lars' neck. She was clearly glad the conversation had shifted to another corner of the room. I think these animals and their friendship can only be good for our town, Nancy Jane continued. They're testaments to the love and closeness of our community, as exemplified by our dear young Miss Prater, who brought our attention to them in the first place. If we're worried about one of them popping up where they shouldn't be, then surely the answer is to give them even more attention, so that we always know where they are. I know I'd love to paint them. They're just the splash of bright color I've been looking for in this town. Everyone loves your paintings, Nancy Jane, Mr. Reardon said, but a lot of us in Ogunquit, we don't sell paintings. We sell food, and we get that food from the water. If something gets in the way of that, we have no food, and then we can't sell the food, and then we don't have any money to buy any of the food that we can never even get. And that's all before we even get to talking about a fish-stealing dog on land. Now we have one messing around in the water as well. Lars perked up at that last part. He didn't always have time to wash his coat, but mangy? There was no need for language like that. No matter what, Mr. Reardon concluded, I think I speak for all of us in the unions when I say that something has to be done. Then he looked over at the Praters, his gaze landing particularly on Natalie's father. Well, he said, maybe not quite all of us. Mr. Prater blushed, but just like Natalie, he didn't let the goading comment get to him. Instead, he rose and spoke slowly and calmly. Lars saw now where Natalie got her backbone from. It's amazing that so many people in this town are so concerned with that dog and a porpoise are going down at the beach to do. It's odd, but it's good. Hearing everyone so concerned shows we care about our town and about one another. And when we care about people, we worry about them. He shot a meaningful glance at Natalie, who tried to act like she hadn't seen it. The townspeople remained silent, looking at Mr. Prater expectantly. But are we sure we're not worrying too much? Mr. Prater continued. It's been a week, and nothing bad has happened so far. What if we're just imagining bad things that might happen instead of things that will happen? When my daughter brought home a stray dog to our house, I imagined lots of bad things might happen. What I got instead was a new friend for her, for both of us, at a time when we really needed one. He glanced back over his shoulder for the briefest of seconds, flicking his gaze toward the strange woman next to Diver Bob. Lars decided he was officially going to have to work even harder on his eavesdropping abilities if he wanted to figure out what was going on there. So let's stay concerned, Mr. Prater said, but let's not give in to worry. Maybe there's a way to get the porpoise to move half a mile up the beach, so he's not right in the cove. Maybe we can apply for a grant for these pingers. Let's give ourselves some time to figure it out, rather than rush to a ruling at one town meeting. Does that sound fair? The whole crowd muttered and nodded, but Mr. Prater wasn't looking at the whole crowd. He was looking first at Mr. Reardon and then up at the mayor. The mayor looked back at Mr. Prater, looked up at the ceiling, and then sighed and nodded. Of course that's fair, he said. But I'll be checking in personally with you, Mr. Prater, so get thinking quick. In the meantime, we'll hold off on taking any drastic action. Natalie gasped with joy, and the buzz in the room began to build as people either celebrated or expressed their doubts. Sensing that the meeting was swiftly coming to an end, Mayor Maher raised his gavel one last time and pointed it directly at Lars. "And make sure that dog wears a leash around town," he said, "at all times." "Wait, what?" Lars looked up at Natalie's face, hoping she wouldn't take that crazy suggestion seriously. But she was already facing away from him, looking back at Diver Bob and the woman who smelled like her. Mayor brought the gavel down one last time. Thwack! And Lars jumped in the air as the meeting adjourned. Chapter 10. Natalie. "I don't think he likes the leash very much," Natalie said. It was Sunday, 2 days since the meeting, and Natalie and her father were sitting at the kitchen table, staring down at Lars, who stared up at them from the floor. Normally, he'd have been up on Natalie's lap, angling for some leftover omelet, but he seemed to have been thrown for a loop by the brown strap that had just been wrapped around his neck. "I don't like the leash very much," Natalie's father said. "Do you know how much it costs to find a waterproof leash for a dog who you know is going to be in the water a lot?" Natalie saw an opening. "In that case, let's return it and—" "But," her father interrupted, "since Mayor is being so nice about Lars, it'd be nice of us to play very squarely by his rules until we get this whole animal situation figured out." Natalie sighed, but in her heart she knew he was right. The leash clearly made both her and Lars uncomfortable. But it was a start. Just like getting her father to let Lars sit under the table was a start toward convincing him to let her keep Lars. Not that she would say that last part out loud just yet. She didn't want to jinx anything. "Speaking of getting things figured out," Mr. Prater said, standing up to clear the plates from the table, "I have to head out. Some people are getting together to discuss what might be done about relocating Banger." "I thought you wanted him to stay." "To a safer part of the beach," Mr. Prater finished quickly. "Still, in Ogunquit, this is a meeting of like-minded people, Natalie." That made Natalie so excited that she got up to help with the cleaning herself. "Can I come?" she asked, depositing some dishes next to her father at the sink. Her father froze. He said, looking at the dishes Natalie had stacked up like they were suddenly the most interesting thing in the world. "You might not want to. That is, this meeting is a meeting for adults," and Natalie recognized that voice. That was the voice her father used when he was trying but failing to explain something serious to his daughter. And one person inspired that voice more than anyone else. "Are you meeting Mom?" Natalie cried out, so loud that Lars leaped up from the floor and bonked his head under the table. "You heard her at the meeting," Mr. Prater said, finally turning to Natalie. "She wants to help. She and Diver Bob? You can't even say his name." Natalie threw her hands up in the air. "Because I know you'll react like this," her father responded. "You know, your mother told me she tried to talk to you after the meeting." It was true. As the townsfolk had filed out of Ogunquit Town Hall, giving Natalie and Lars either quick smiles or discouraging scowls, Natalie had felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned around to see her mother, her face the picture of concern. "Natalie," she'd said, "I just wanted to say—" Lars has to pee," Natalie blurted out, and she'd run from the room, followed by a confused but loyal Lars. "I just don't see why they have to be involved," Natalie said. "I think we can figure things out on our own." Her father closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and held it for several moments. When he exhaled, he opened his eyes again, and they looked different from before, less defensive, more forgiving. This annoyed Natalie, who did not feel she had done anything she needed to be forgiven for. "Everyone needs help sometimes," he said. "You should know that better than anyone, since you're always going out of your way to help people, and porpoises, and even smelly stray dogs." Natalie looked down at Lars, who had wandered into the kitchen, in case any omelet bits were going to get dropped during all the yelling. His leash trailed limply on the floor behind him. "I guess," she said, "I just think if you're going to help someone, you shouldn't leave them." She looked back up at her father, and this time he didn't seem to have an answer. Just then there was a knock on the front door. It was a strange knock because it came from the bottom half of the door, as if someone very short wanted to come inside. Sure enough, when Natalie's father opened the door, he had to look down to see who was knocking. It was little Sam Reardon, wearing a ridiculously puffy life jacket. Mrs. Reardon stood behind him on the Prater's porch, smiling sheepishly. "Hello, Natalie," she said. "Jim?" She nodded at Natalie's father. "I was wondering if Banger is back at the beach, and I want to go talk to him before he goes away. Now, now, now!" Sam burst in, waving his arms up and down as much as the life jacket would allow. Mr. Prater laughed, and despite herself, Natalie giggled. "I was at the market when someone said the porpoise was back," Mrs. Reardon explained. "Obviously, I can't let Sam go without adult supervision, but I'm busy running errands, and my husband, well..." She didn't have to finish the sentence. Mr. Prater's big speech at the town meeting had convinced the mayor to hold off on running Banger out of town, but it had also made a lot of people very unhappy, specifically people Mr. Prater saw out on the water every day. As the head of the Lobstermen's Union, Mr. Reardon was chief among the complainants. "I'm sorry, Stephanie," said Natalie's father. "I'd love to help, but I have to go talk to..." He caught Natalie's glare and had the decency to look embarrassed. "I have to go to a meeting." "Oh, okay," Mrs. Reardon said, taking Sam by the hand and quickly leading him away from the porch before the boy could figure out what was happening and begin the according meltdown. "Well, sorry to bother you." "Not so fast," Natalie said. "I think I know an adult who can help us." She picked up Lars' leash and put on some sandals. "Come on, Sam," she said. "We're going next door." Less than half an hour later, Natalie sat on the beach watching vigilantly as Sam, now with giant water wings to accompany his giant life jacket, waddled around in the surf. Next to him, barking encouragingly, was Lars, whose leash had been left in a pile next to Natalie's beach towel in a quiet act of rebellion. And a little farther out in the water, Banger puffed with his usual impatience, clearly not totally understanding this new addition to their usual party, but eager to figure it out as soon as possible. Beside Natalie was Nancy Jane, who was also surveying the scene, but shifting her focus occasionally to take photos with an old camera or to jot off quick sketches of the figures splashing in the surf. "Thank you so much for inviting me down here," Nancy Jane said, putting a colored pencil down on her towel and picking up a regular one. "I've been hoping to draw Banger and Lars together all week." It didn't seem all that easy. She would get halfway through a sketch of Banger breaching the surface, and then he would dive out of sight, only to reappear again, 5 seconds later, 10 yards away. Lars didn't seem too keen on cooperating either. "I'm sorry," Natalie said. "It must be frustrating trying to draw something that won't stay still." Nancy Jane shook her head, smiling warmly. "That's exactly what I want to capture," she said. "That speed, that exuberance, that joy of life. That's what Banger and Lars bring to this town." She turned her smile toward Natalie. "That's what you brought to this town." Although Natalie had been in a bad mood when she left her father at the shack, seeing the animals and herself through Nancy Jane's eyes made everything feel a little bit better. Then she looked back out at the water, and her mood came crashing down almost instantly. There, out past the far point of Perkins Cove, was a small boat with an unmistakably large cartoon face using a snorkel painted on the side. It was Diver Bob, his megaphone carrying across the water as he lectured someone about whatever poor, unsuspecting starfish he just pulled up from the deep. Apparently, he'd skipped out on whatever meeting Natalie's parents were having. Good, Natalie thought. She couldn't quite see who was on the boat from here, but there didn't seem to be many passengers. Probably just those same confused tourists who'd been at the meeting Friday night. Ugh, Natalie said. Who'd want to go on one of those dumb tours? Those are for babies. As if on cue, Sam saw the boat in the distance and started hopping up and down and yelling and waving. Lars decided to get in on the act, barking and howling happily. Banger poked his head out of the water curiously and swiveled around. See? Natalie said, laughing despite herself. Rather than answer right away, Nancy Jane erased a few lines from her sketch pad and then blew on the eraser dust, allowing it to fall and mingle with the sand. I seem to recall, she said, that you were one of those babies once. You used to love Diver Bob's tours. Yeah, well, people change, Natalie said. Nancy Jane hummed softly to herself as she redid the shading on a dorsal fin and then held it up to the light for inspection. And it seemed to me, she said, maintaining a casual tone, like Diver Bob really wanted to help you and your friends at the meeting. Your mother, too. Natalie looked over at Nancy Jane to see if she was making fun of Natalie, but Nancy Jane's face was a mask of concentration as she finished putting the finishing touches on a drawing of a cresting wave. For as long as Natalie had been alive, Nancy Jane had lived next door to the Praters, even acting as Natalie's babysitter on more than one occasion. When Natalie's parents went out, back when they were still together and still went out, Natalie would go over to Nancy Jane's studio. While Nancy Jane worked on painting a beautiful sunset, Natalie would sit beside her and work on a paint-by-numbers kit. Sometimes Nancy Jane would hang Natalie's paintings next to hers at the Coveside Cafe. Not one of them had ever sold, but it made Natalie incredibly proud to see her work up next to a real professional's. As far as she was concerned, Nancy Jane was one of the nicest people in Ogunquit, maybe in the whole world. But that didn't mean Natalie agreed with her on everything. Natalie looked back out across the ocean. Banger did a jump for Sam, who laughed and clapped his hands, or tried to do as much as his puffy flotation equipment would allow. From far away, she could hear the tourists on Diver Bob's boat ooh and ah. Nancy Jane, Natalie said, why do so many people leave? Nancy Jane put her sketch pad down and looked directly at Natalie. Well, if this is about your mother, I'm not sure it's fair to say she left. She didn't go away, after all. She just went somewhere else. Natalie loved Nancy Jane, but that sentence made her roll her eyes. That's literally what leaving is, she said. Is it? Nancy Jane pointed with her pencil out of the water where Banger had just resurfaced close to shore. Take Banger, Nancy Jane said. One moment he's here, then he's over there. Tomorrow night he might be somewhere else entirely, but that's not the same thing as leaving someone. He's just going to wherever the joy of life takes him. Natalie Jane shook her head. No way, that's not the same at all. Besides, I read a lot about harbor porpoises this week, and I found out that once they find a place they like, a lot of them tend to just stay there. When she'd read that, she'd almost dance with excitement. That meant if Banger liked Perkins Cove, and it seemed like he did, he might stay a long time, maybe even forever. See, I think more people should be like that, Natalie went on. When they find a good thing, they should notice it, and they should hold on to it. Rather than bristle, Nancy Jane just laughed. This makes you happy, right? As she pointed to Lars and Sam. It certainly makes me happy, but I feel like it makes you very happy. Natalie nodded. I love Lars. And Banger is like a miracle. He saved Lars' life. The most amazing part is, the most amazing part is this. I thought so, Nancy said, but I'd never have guessed it from how you were sitting here worrying. Worrying is for old people, Natalie. You're young, and something amazing is happening in front of you. When I see something amazing, I try to record it. Halfway through Jane's speech, Natalie had opened her mouth to protest, but as Nancy Jane had gone on, Natalie had closed her mouth again. Then she had really listened, and then she smiled and laughed. Nancy Jane was right. Thank you, Natalie said, throwing her arms around her neighbor in a big hug. Hey, Sam, she cried. Want to see what a harbor porpoise looks like up close? Natalie picked Sam up, which was not unlike lifting a beach ball with a person in the middle of it, and waded carefully out into the water. She made sure to hold Sam well above the waves until he was near enough to reach out and wrap his little fingers around Banger's dorsal fin. Sam's face cracked open in a bright smile, and Natalie couldn't help but smile as well, especially when Lars paddled up to her and nudged her elbow with his nose, teasing. The four of them stayed there and played for the rest of the morning until Sam got tired and asked to go home. And even though Diver Bob's boat returned halfway through, sailing right across Natalie's sight line, she found it hard to get upset. After all, the boat was way out there, and Natalie had her good thing right here, and she intended to hold on to it for as long as she possibly could. That's it for tonight, and we will begin tomorrow with Chapter 11, Banger. Sleep tight.